Hello everybody and welcome back to Red Eagle Politics. Make sure you like this video down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. So, the midterm election polls right here in the RCP average have it as a dead heat between Democrats and Republicans. And a lot of people might be saying, wait, I thought this was supposed to be a red wave year. I thought that Biden's unpopular and that Republicans should be at least leading the polls in the popular vote for the national average. And I believe that this lead is a mirage and it will not last long. And I'm going to explain why in this video, because there have been some more recent polls that have been dropping with likely voter screens. A lot of the polls that have Democrats up just poll registered voters. If you are registered to vote in general, if you are not even likely to turn out, they will poll you. And then they will come up with the result. And there usually tends to be a lot of undecideds, etc. But when they poll likely voters, in every single poll, Republicans are either tied or they are leading. And the one poll they're tied in, by the way, with likely voters is Emerson, the same poll that is an outlier for Biden's approval rating. And typically it's not an outlier, so that could very well be a one-off that has Republicans and Democrats tied. But we're going to dive into this a little bit in this video and explain why I believe the red wave is still on and why it is just taking off. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're going to gain like 70 seats in the House or whatever, but still this notion that, oh, this is just a red ripple or this is some like Democrat favorable year are absolutely laughable. And they are going to retake the House and the Senate and probably have a net gain in the governorships as well. So we're going to dive into this, but first I have to tell you guys about our newest sponsors over at Private Internet Access. Privacy on the web is very important, and there is no better way to ensure your privacy than to have a VPN. Private Internet Access is the world's most transparent VPN provider with over 30 million downloads. They have 10 years of VPN expertise and run on 100% open source software. Private Internet Access works with all major streaming services, so you have unrestricted access to all your favorite content anywhere in the world. It's available with all platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and many more. And while helping safeguard your online privacy, their VPN software also blocks ads, trackers, and malicious websites. By using the link in the description or pinned comment below, you can grab an 82% discount. That's just $2.11 per month, and you get 3 extra months completely free. It's risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so act now. You won't regret it. So here we go. Republicans and Democrats in a virtual tie in the RCP average with 10% undecided. We are currently sitting here approximately, give or take, 45 days or so away from the 2022 midterms, and Republicans are well within striking distance of winning every single toss-up Senate race. We've covered it over the past couple weeks extensively on this channel. Masters is gaining, especially with the new Kelly scandal that dropped. A lot of undecided voters could very well break for Masters because of it. You look at what's going on in the state of Nevada, where Laxalt has taken a major lead in the polls. You look at Georgia being a dead heat with Herschel Walker gaining a little bit despite being outspent 3-1. And you look at Oz getting the base on board in Pennsylvania while maintaining a lead with independent voters. And then you couple that with the fact that even the polls that historically underestimate Republicans in Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida show them up by, outside of the margin of error or so. And then it looks like the Senate were on board for a decent victory there. And even if we had an even national environment, those states, given how they usually vote compared to the national environment, they're usually to the right of the national environment by a couple of points or so. So even if this was true and Democrats had a lead of 0.3% and that was the final margin, Republicans still probably would take back the Senate and take back the House. But either way, likely voters versus registered voters does matter. You look at this registered voter polls here. Dems by 5, tied, which is NBC News. Fox News, which is not a right-leaning pollster despite the media's network bias to the Republican establishment, they have Democrats up by 3. Fox News polls typically are garbage. Regardless of which direction they're often, New York Times has Democrats up by just 2. And a lot of these polls in 2020 for the generic ballot, they had Dems winning by like 8 or 9, and they only won by like 3 in the generic House vote. Trafalgar is likely voters has Republicans up by 6, which we'll get to that in a second. But Harvard-Harris and other registered voter polls with no undecided voters in that poll got it at Dems plus 2, 51-49. So Beyond that point, that is probably an average of D+3, D+4 with the registered voter polls. Now look at the likely voter polls. ABC News, Washington Post, which again, in their registered sample had Republicans up by 1. Now they have Republicans up by 5. And that's kind of the wave that we were looking for, right? That's the wave. And ABC News, Washington Post, they're not exactly really right-leaning pollsters in the slightest. Historically, I believe that they were significantly off in several election cycles in the past. Same thing for CBS News, which has Republicans leading by 1. Emerson has them tied, and that's, again, a likely voter poll that's sort of an outlier at the presidential approval level. And then Rasmussen, they have Republicans up by 2, and Trafalgar has them up by 6. So you look at the aggregate there, and then you're seeing a vastly different story. Hey, wait a minute, that's like R+2, R+3. And that's kind of the wave that we're looking at. Now, has the wave magnitude dissipated a little bit from what we initially expected at the start of the year? Potentially. A lot of people will say, oh, it's because of Dobbs v. Jackson. It's because of the abortion decision. And I really don't believe that to be the case. Very few voters put abortion as their top issue. Did it energize the left a little bit? I mean, it's really hard to tell because in these special elections where Republicans underperformed, you look at the total turnout and it was vastly below the Dem turnout for special elections in 2020 and in 2018. So it can't exactly be that as the driving factor. And when you had higher turnout in the one New York district, the Molinaro district, compared to the other district that Republicans won but still underperformed in that district, which is trending to the left, you did see them get in line with Trump's margins in 2020. It was not exactly a vast underperformance, unlike the other district, which actually had lower turnout. And in a midterm year where you're expecting higher turnout from Republicans, higher turnout from white working class voters in general, you would be anticipating Republicans to perform better in the midterms than they did in the special elections. And you might say, well, there were some special elections before Dobbs, and they had Republicans, overperforming. But you look at the demographics of those districts that traditionally vote Republican in them, and those that traditionally vote Democrat. A lot of the Democrats in those districts tended to be more minority. The Republicans historically in that district tended to be a little bit more college-educated white, whereas in a district like New York's 19th that we saw, a lot of the voters that did show up were college-educated white voters, and a lot of the Trump base are low-propensity white working-class voters. So that kind of explains it. But either way, it's a little bit beside the point. I wanted to make a comparison between this year and another year that was kind of, I wouldn't say like my first year following politics, but I vaguely do remember refreshing the election night results on my phone back in 2014. Quite some time ago, actually. I know it's been, a very long time since then, but either way, going back all the way to 2014, which was 8 years ago, hard to believe time flies by pretty quickly. There was a similar situation in the polls. And you look at the polls from 2014 in RCP, Democrats actually, despite Obama's low approval rating, which was comparable to Biden's right now, Democrats held the lead in the polling aggregate until early to mid-September. And that's when Republicans took a lead. There still were a decent amount of the public that was undecided, and Republicans actually outperformed the polling average, but still they showed, signs of gaining after Labor Day in the coming weeks. They showed signs of gaining when there started to be more and more likely voter screens. And 2010 was like this to a lesser extent as well. But either way, we know this and we understand that's how it works. When the likely voter screens are in place, that's what happens. And more polls are having them in place, but not enough of them. Obviously, the Economist YouGov poll, again, how many undecideds do they still have in that poll? 15% undecided. Not only that, it's a registered voter poll. Those are the polls that probably should be, taken with a grain of salt, especially right now as we move forward to the midterms. But even so, 2014 was a comparable year. You saw Republicans pick up around 30 seats in the House or so, maybe a little bit less than that. And you saw them, sweep a lot of the toss-up Senate races, and they retook the Senate. And they also won some swing state governorships and flipped them red or held them red that they had from 2010, but they also lost a couple that were, relatively competitive, like Pennsylvania. They lost Pennsylvania, lost a couple of other states as well. And I'm not saying Republicans are going to lose those same states this time around, but there are parallels there because I do anticipate Republicans to flip some governorships, but I don't know if they're really going to sweep every single competitive governorship. Although for the Senate races, yeah, I think they will sweep Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Ohio. Some of those aren't even really competitive or toss-ups, but they're also going to likely flip Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and I do believe at this point they're on track to hold Pennsylvania. So that would bring some parallels, into play regarding the 2014 midterms, and that is true. And again, the polling aggregate, you look at the polling aggregate, Republicans and Dems were tied. Republicans took the lead sometime in the fall, and then you saw them outperform the final polling average, which is still possibly going to happen because that's how it's worked the past few election cycles. This is true. You look at 2020, polls vastly underestimated Republicans. 2018, in a lot of places, they did too. Nobody ever talks about it because the generic ballot polls were pretty much accurate. But even so, Dems had the energy factor, so it's very possible that if those were the polls, but Republicans were more energized, that they would have also outperformed the polls, kind of like a masked polling error, I guess you could say. In 2018 at the national level, and then in 2016, the national polls were not really that far off. However, in a lot of the swing states and competitive races, they were awful. Again, the same polls that said Trump would lose Wisconsin by 6 or 7 in the aggregate were off by 6 or 7 points in 2016 and 2020. So it just really goes to show that Republicans, they have some work to do. And in terms of why they may not be running away with this regardless is because of, in my opinion, messaging. They got to get on message, and we'll talk about that in a video later this week about how they can, improve their messaging. But with the economy looking to be in limbo, a potential downturn that could happen, already you're seeing gas prices in many places go up over the past week. That was what was saving Biden's approval rating from really staying in the mid-30s. Kind of really shows that there is a lot of potential for Democrats to fall. And a lot of Democrats are getting cocky right now. It's like we've seen this movie before, but Republicans got to keep, pushing at it. They got to keep going. This is not exactly the time to be complacent. This is not the time to take the foot off the gas. If anything, we need to put the foot on the gas and just hold it down as much as we possibly can. That's how we're going to win the midterms. We got this. It's still ours for the taking. You're going to have as many America First candidates rise up and become in power as you possibly can. A lot of people on the internet like to overreact to every little thing on the timeline. It's very annoying. But in the real world, it's still Republicans for the taking. It is definitely going to be competitive in a lot of places, but that doesn't mean that Republicans are not favored to win the House or the Senate, or they can't. And Nate Plastic will take an L yet again, and he'll probably lose whatever hair is left on his head at this point out of stress after the midterms, and he'll try to cope about it just like he coped about 2020 and 2016. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Like this video down below, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications so you never miss another video. Follow me on social media. The links are all in the description down below. As always, guys, thanks for watching. Red Eagle, out.